Dr. Zilrax tightened his grip on the medical scanner, his bioluminescent eyes narrowing at the creature sprawled across the examination table. It was wounded, its fur matted with blood, its body trembling with pain, but still he hesitated. The scent of its perspiration, its erratic breathing, the sharp gleam of its fangs, it all pointed to the same conclusion. This was a predator. The Zorakian exhaled slowly through his slitted nostrils, suppressing the primal unease creeping up his spine. He had trained for decades, learned the intricate anatomy of over 1,000 species, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for treating a creature from Earth. Even the thought of it sent a shudder through his ridged exoskeleton. "This is a mistake," he murmured, directing his voice toward his assistant, a jittery Cernathai with curling antennae who was already inching away from the table. "It should not be here." The human standing opposite him straightened, her sharp blue eyes locking onto his. Dr. Laura Carter was small for her species, but her posture, the set of her jaw, radiated authority. "It's an injured dog, not a Targassian deathstalker," she said. "You're a doctor, aren't you?" Zilrax flinched at the word. Doctor. He had taken an oath to heal, to set aside fear and prejudice in the face of suffering. But that was before he had seen the Earth records, before he had studied what their creatures were capable of. This canine, this seemingly pathetic, whimpering thing, was classified as an apex predator, a beast honed by thousands of years of survival, of hunting, of killing. "I am a doctor," he admitted, "but I am not a fool. This animal is unpredictable." Laura scoffed, reaching out to brush the dog's head with her fingers. It exhaled a slow, pained breath, its dark eyes blinking up at her with a trust that Zilrax could not fathom. "It's scared," she said, "not dangerous." The alien clinic was silent, except for the soft whir of machinery and the faint hum of the sterilization fields. The other staff, an assortment of different species, each giving the dog a wide berth, watched with bated breath. Zilrax's mandibles clicked in frustration. Humans have a habit of forgetting what their creatures are. This one may not attack you, but it could still be dangerous to others. Laura didn't flinch. "So can half the patients you treat on a daily basis. You think a Velothian mauler isn't dangerous? Or a Norgathy spine beast?" She gestured to the unconscious canine. "This one weighs, 40 kilograms? A mauler could tear your limbs off in 2 seconds, and yet you treat them without hesitation." Zilrax's eyes flicked toward the wound on the dog's flank, where the plasma burn had scorched deep into its flesh. It would need sutures, antiseptic regeneration treatment. Nothing beyond his skill, yet his hands refused to move. "The difference," he said carefully, "is that I understand those creatures. I know their instincts. This one," he pointed toward the dog, whose tail gave the weakest of thumps against the table, "is an Earth species. That alone makes it unpredictable." Laura let out a slow breath, tilting her head as if considering something. Then she turned, pulling a scanner from her belt. "Fine. You're scared. I get it." Zilrax bristled. "I am not. Let me ask you something." She cut him off, stepping closer, her voice calm but firm. "If I had brought in a wounded human child instead of a dog, would you refuse to treat it?" His mandibles clicked shut. That was a trap of a question. Humans were technically predators, too, flesh-eating omnivores, just like their creatures. And yet, despite their classification, Zilrax had worked beside them, spoken to them, treated them. Laura pressed on. "I know what the Zorakian records say about Earth, that our world breeds killers, that our animals are the deadliest in the galaxy. But tell me something, Doctor, when was the last time you treated a human who hunted for sport? When was the last time you watched one tear into its food with its own claws?" Zilrax said nothing. Laura gestured toward the dog again. "This isn't a wild predator. It's been domesticated for thousands of years. It doesn't hunt because it has to. It lives with us, protects us. We raised it to be our companion, not our competitor." The dog let out a weak whimper, its head barely lifting off the table. It didn't snarl. It didn't snap. Zilrax's fingers twitched. Laura saw the hesitation and pressed further. "Look at it. Does that look like a monster to you?" His gaze lingered on the creature's face. It was in pain, yes, but there was something else there. Something that contradicted every lesson he had been taught about apex predators. There was trust, submission, a silent plea for help. Zilrax let out a slow breath. He reached for his medical tools. "Very well," he said at last. "But if it bites me, I expect you to take full responsibility." Laura grinned. "If it bites you, I'll buy you dinner." Zilrax muttered something under his breath and activated the scanner. The device hummed, casting a soft blue light over the canine's body. Internal trauma was minimal. External damage, serious but treatable. He could fix this. As he adjusted the settings on the wound applicator, the dog let out a quiet sound. Zilrax stiffened. Laura chuckled. "It's just a whine. Means it's nervous, but it trusts you." Zilrax didn't understand how an animal could simultaneously fear and trust the same being. It was an oxymoron. It defied logic. But as he pressed the applicator to the wound and the dog simply whined again, pressing its head deeper into the table instead of lashing out, something in him shifted. He had always thought of fear as a warning, an instinct that demanded caution. But perhaps, in some creatures, fear was simply a signal for something else. Perhaps it was a request for kindness. Zilrax exhaled and continued his work. The device in Dr. Zilrax's hands emitted a quiet hum as he guided it over the canine's torn flesh. The tissue regeneration process was straightforward. Burnt cells were restructured, pain receptors dampened, but his mind remained unsettled. He had treated creatures far more dangerous than this, and yet, with each whimper or twitch of the earth animal's muscles, his fingers tightened around the medical instrument. It was irrational. He knew it, but knowledge alone did not erase instinct. Across the table, Dr. Laura Carter worked with a practiced ease, wiping away excess antiseptic, adjusting the dog's position with careful precision. Every so often, she murmured soft words meant not for him, but for the creature beneath her hands. "You're doing good, buddy. Almost done." The dog's ears flicked, responding to her voice as though it understood. Zilrax tried not to dwell on that. He focused on the wound instead, watching as the laceration sealed under the device's guided energy. The canine exhaled, its body relaxing slightly. Still no sign of aggression. No growling, no snapping jaws. Its species was capable of tearing through flesh, yet here it lay, utterly vulnerable. "You are certain it will not attack when it regains strength?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Laura lifted an eyebrow. "Would you attack the surgeon who just saved your life?" Zilrax hesitated. It was not an equivalent comparison. Most creatures react to pain with hostility. Laura gave a short chuckle. "Most creatures, sure, but not this one. You have to understand, Zilrax, dogs aren't just animals to us. They're family." She ran a hand down the canine's side, her fingers pressing lightly into the thick fur. "They don't just tolerate us. They love us. That's why this one hasn't fought back. He knows we're helping." The word love sat strangely in Zilrax's mind. It was not that his species lacked the concept, but the idea of an apex predator forming such a bond with a species it should logically consider lesser, willingly offering loyalty rather than dominance, unsettled something deep in his worldview. And yet, despite this love, he said carefully, it is still driven by biological instinct. It still retains its predatory nature. Laura shrugged. "So do humans. And yet, here we are." Zilrax had no retort for that. He turned his attention back to the scanner, focusing on the deeper tissue layers, ensuring no underlying damage had been missed. The rhythmic rise and fall of the dog's chest had evened out. The sedative had worked. He should have been reassured, but instead, he found himself watching its face, the tiny flickers of muscle movements, the subtle twitch of its nose. "What happened to it?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. "How was it injured?" Laura's expression darkened. She reached for a cloth, wiping a smear of antiseptic off her wrist. "Ship accident. Engine flare caught him when he tried to follow his owner onto the loading bay. It was a freak accident, but her jaw tightened. I don't think anyone expected him to survive the blast." Zilrax studied the wounds again, reevaluating. He had seen what plasma burns could do, the way they melted through flesh and shattered bone. And yet, here this creature was alive, enduring. A lesser species would have succumbed. Laura nodded. He's strong, not just physically, but in spirit. She glanced at him, eyes measuring. You understand resilience, don't you? Zilrax stiffened slightly. Zorakians were a proud species, known for their endurance, their meticulous discipline. Resilience was something he had been trained to respect. And yet, he had not extended that respect here. The scanner beeped softly, signaling the final stage of tissue repair. The worst of the damage was gone now, leaving behind only patches of raw but stable skin where the fur had burned away. Zilrax withdrew the device, setting it on the tray beside him. The immediate damage has been neutralized. It will require monitoring, but the risk of infection is low. Laura exhaled, relief washing over her face. Thank you. Zilrax found himself unable to respond immediately. He had treated the creature, had fulfilled his role, and yet he could not shake the strange unease sitting in his chest. It was not fear. Not anymore. Something else. The dog stirred. Zilrax stiffened, every muscle tensing. Laura noticed, but before she could say anything, the canine let out a low, groggy sound, a half-whine, half-sigh. Its dark eyes blinked open sluggishly, struggling against the sedation. Zilrax took a step back. He had seen creatures wake from unconsciousness in many ways, thrashing, snarling, biting, but this one simply lifted its head slightly, eyes unfocused, gaze shifting between them. Then, without hesitation, it licked Laura's hand. She smiled. Hey, buddy, we got you fixed up. Zilrax barely noticed her words. He was too busy staring. The creature had acknowledged her. Yes, but more than that, it had responded with affection. A gesture of trust, despite its injuries, despite the unfamiliar environment, despite everything. It turned its head toward him. Zilrax felt his breath catch. He had anticipated a snarl, a warning, but instead the canine's tail gave the smallest of movements, a weak, slow wag. His body remained rigid. It recognizes me. Laura nodded. Yeah, it does. Zilrax couldn't look away. He had spent his entire career learning the patterns of nature, the immutable laws that govern survival. Predators did not trust. The strong did not submit. And yet, here in front of him was a living contradiction. He didn't understand it. Not yet. But for the first time, he wanted to. The dog's breathing had steadied, its body no longer trembling with pain, but Dr. Zilrax remained motionless. He had spent years refining his skills, controlling his reactions, ensuring that nothing interfered with his precision. And yet, as the earth creature looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes, he felt something beyond clinical detachment pressing into his thoughts. The dog blinked slowly. Its gaze, though clouded with the remnants of sedation, held no hostility, no challenge, just awareness. You can touch him, you know, Laura said, her voice carrying a note of amusement. She was seated on a stool now, one hand absently running through the dog's fur. He won't bite. Zilrax hesitated. His four fingers twitched at his side, the bioluminescent markings along his arms dimming in uncertainty. I see no medical necessity for... Come on, Laura interrupted, tilting her head toward the dog. Call it scientific curiosity. You're already reevaluating your entire stance on Earth predators. Might as well take it a step further. Zilrax wanted to argue. He wanted to retreat to logic, to the careful, structured understanding of biological classifications and evolutionary patterns. But none of those things explained why this creature, this so-called apex predator, was watching him with something that looked suspiciously like recognition. Slowly, cautiously, he extended a hand. The dog remained still, though its ears twitched as his fingers hovered just above its head. Zilrax had examined countless creatures, had treated wounds far more severe than this, but the act of placing his palm against the thick fur felt strangely foreign. The texture surprised him, coarse and soft in different places, a warmth beneath the surface that pulsed with life. He expected the creature to flinch, to react, but instead the dog exhaled a deep sigh and leaned, just slightly, into his touch. Zilrax froze. Laura grinned. Congratulations. You've been accepted. He withdrew his hand immediately, flexing his fingers as if to confirm they were still intact. That was unexpected. She laughed. Yeah, well, that's kind of the theme with humans and our animals. She studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. So what do you think? Still convinced he's a mindless killer? Zilrax glanced at the dog, who had settled back onto the table, eyes already beginning to drift closed. The tail, still weak from exhaustion, thumped once. I do not understand it, he admitted. Laura smirked. I'll take that as progress. Zilrax frowned, but there was no real irritation behind it. He turned his gaze back to the sleeping animal, his mind turning over the implications. This creature should have fought, should have resisted, instead had chosen trust. You claim this is typical of its species, he said. Laura nodded. Dogs have been with us for thousands of years. They were predators once, sure, but we evolved together. They learned to work with us, not against us. That bond isn't just instinct anymore. It's something deeper. Zilrax considered her words. He had spent his career categorizing life forms, understanding their patterns, their place in the universe. And yet, this was something that defied simple classification. This bond, he murmured, it is not merely biological. No, Laura said softly. It's not. A long silence stretched between them. The clinic's quiet hum filled the space, punctuated only by the rhythmic rise and fall of the dog's chest. For the first time in a long while, Zilrax found himself faced with something he could not easily explain. And for the first time, he wanted to understand.